Well, all right. Most of us are familiar with Daniel chapter 5, at least the stories in Daniel chapter 5. But like we talked about last time, there is some time discrepancy between chapters 4 and 5. We talked about it in greater detail in chapter 4, so go watch that video to get caught up. This chapter is not about Nebuchadnezzar. This chapter is about Belshazzar. He is the ruler or an interim ruler, not a true ruler, of the kingdom at this time. Now, Belshazzar maybe is a grandson to Nebuchadnezzar, or a great grandson, really. But it's probably more grandson actually. But according to Babylonian records, there's a few kings in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Belshazzar's dad was not Nebuchadnezzar; it was Nabonidus. So that's where there's some discrepancy in chapter 4. So go watch the video for chapter 4 to go over that if you haven't. So let's jump into chapter 5. So Belshazzar is the king at this point. The records don't show him as like a true king, but he's kind of like an interim king while his dad is away, type of idea. So this is where Belshazzar is, and it's pretty clear that he was probably a bit of a spoiled brat in the palace. So let's get in here. Verse 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So he's got a heck of a feast and party going on. Verse 2, Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. Probably a grandfather technically, that the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines might drink therein. So Belshazzar is like, go get the goblets. Go get those goblets that are from the Jerusalem temple, and let's drink out of those. Those are fancy goblets. It doesn't tell us much more than that about why he picked those goblets, why they weren't there at the feast anyways, why somebody had to go get them and bring them in. They're probably kept in the king's vault, basically, because they were relics from an ancient time. To realize this story is taking place about 70 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is towards the end of the exile. This is the beginning of that transition for the Jews to leave Babylon. So just realize that what we're learning now is at the end of that 70-year period, basically towards the end of that. So Belshazzar wasn't even alive when this happened. In fact, there's a good chance his dad might not even have been alive when Nebuchadnezzar did his destruction of Babylon, basically. Verse 3, then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines, drank in them. So let's look at this. To give you a bit, in fact, before I jump into that, to give you a bit, I forgot I had a note here about Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Belshazzar never reigned as sole king and is never designated as king in the cuneiform inscriptions. So this is the actual Babylonian texts. Furthermore, it is maintained that there is no evidence to show that Belshazzar ever ruled upon the throne as a subordinate to Nabonidus, his father. In reply to these charges, we may note, first of all, what the Aramaic word king need not have the connotation of monarch or sole king. So when we talk about Belshazzar's king in Daniel, that doesn't mean he was the king, but maybe a lesser governor or the son of a king or something like that. He was royalty, but not the royalty. Furthermore, one of the cuneiform documents expressly states that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar. In all probability, there was a co-regency between Nabonidus and Belshazzar, in which Belshazzar occupied a subordinate position. Since, however, he was the man upon the throne with whom Israel had to do, he is designated king in the book of Daniel. No valid objection can be raised against this usage. That's Guthrie and Moyder's New Bible Commentary, page 694, that brings that up. So that's I forgot why I had that note, so I wanted to make sure that got recorded and put in there. And it's in the notes too. So let's get into the rest of the story here about the Belshazzar and the princes and all these people drinking out of these sacred cups. In Kyle and Delitzsch's Bible commentary, they noted here that Babylonians drank out of the holy vessels of the temple of God of Israel to glorify their heathen gods in songs of praise. In doing this, they did not only place Jehovah on a perfect level with their gods, but raised them above the Lord of heaven, as Daniel charged the king. The carrying away of the temple vessels to Babylon and placing them in the temple of Bel was a sign of the defeat of the god to whom these vessels were consecrated. The use of these vessels in the drinking of wine at a festival amid the singing of songs in praise of the gods was accordingly a celebrating of these gods as victorious over the God of Israel. So probably when Nebuchadnezzar took those goblets, he put them in the temple of Bel, and that was a sign, these are the sacred emblems of the other god. They're in my temple of my god to show my god's more powerful than their god. Then drinking out of them, using them as common things, desecrates them, which shows, and they're doing this festival, from what Colin Delich is saying, they believe this festival is about promoting their gods above the Jewish God, basically. So verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So there we go. That just clarified that right there, is that this was, they're using this festival to praise their gods, their idols, and they're desecrating the Jewish God at the same time, basically, which doesn't make him happy. Now, verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. So the candlestick is where the light is coming from, and so there's a shadow being shown, basically. Sorry about sneeze there. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So he only saw a little bit of the hand that's writing on the wall, basically. This is actually where the phrase "the writing on the wall" comes from. If you ever heard that before of this, we use it today as an assumption. The writing's on the wall. Well, it's clear what was going to happen. We knew it. We were told ahead of time what was going to happen. This is kind of where this story comes from, basically. Verse 6, then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Now you have to realize, joints of his loins, your loins, like your internal organs, don't have joints. He's probably talking about hips, and then he talks specifically about his knees. So he might be having a hard time standing. He might be shuddering and shaking a lot. Now they've been drinking quite a bit as well. So he sees his hand, and you got to admit, if you saw just part of a hand and no body attached to it writing on a wall, you'd be a little afraid too. It's really interesting. In fact, the new Revised Standard Version of the Bible said in this part, his limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. So he's a little panicky, a little afraid, maybe even wetting himself at this point, going, oh my gosh, what the heck is going on? I mean, could you imagine that? You're having a great time, you're partying, and then suddenly this part of this hand appears and starts writing stuff on the wall. That'd be a little crazy. You'd be like, what am I drinking? What's going on? That'd be something else. So verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. So he's, get him in here. What is going on with this? You got to come figure this out. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, Guthrie and Moiter in their Bible commentary said the Hebrew word that is translated third ruler means one of three. So this would put whoever can interpret it as almost a king of Babylon. So one of three, meaning there's three people who are the highest rulers there, and he's probably talking about Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and then Belshazzar is going to elevate this person up to his same status, basically. And this is a big deal. I mean, he's like laying it out. This is a major reward for anybody who can interpret this. So verse 8, then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Could you imagine that? You're like, oh man, I really wish I could figure out how to make this work. Because that's a big reward to be given to do that. And they're like, we just can't do it. Then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. There's that word astonished. We learned about that last chapter as well. Verse 10, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. So here is a queen who's going to come in and influence the king. Verse 11, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. So she knows about Daniel and understands what he has done before for Nebuchadnezzar, and for others probably too. So she might be sober because she wasn't at the party. She came in later, so she might not have been there at this party, which kind of leads you to believe what kind of a relationship did Belshazzar have with his wife. Basically, he was there with his concubines and his friends, but not his wife. So she's saying, like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So this is the queen saying, go talk to Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar trusted him and brought him up to be the ruler over all of the magicians and Chaldeans. So you should probably consult him too. Verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king. Now here's something that's fascinating. When the king called for his magicians, Daniel didn't come. Could it be some people didn't want Daniel to be the one that interpreted this? Maybe there's a little bit of animosity against Daniel in the royal court. They wanted the Babylonian people to have it. Because imagine a Jew being brought up to be third in command, one of three in all of Babylon. This is their enemy. This is the ones that have been exiled. But now he's becoming the ruler over everything. So maybe they didn't let Daniel know to give the other magicians a chance. But now the queen's like, actually, we're missing one. We need Daniel. He's the leader of these people. He should be here. So the king's like, well, why isn't he here? Bring him in. So that's verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. The king spake, said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee in this, that the spirit of the God is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Now this is interesting because basically Daniel's having to prove he is who he say he is, which means Belshazzar only hears of the stories of Daniel, but hasn't consulted Daniel. So maybe Daniel is no longer in the position he used to be in. Maybe Daniel is not consulted as much. Maybe he's kind of retired, if you will, from that, which he didn't really retire back then. But maybe Daniel's old. I mean, this has been 70 years. Daniel's got to be 80s, 90s, probably somewhere around there. So that's also why they didn't bring Daniel in. But now they're going to bring him in. Verse 15, and now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, and they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. So Daniel's not interested in the glories and the rewards and stuff, basically. Yet I will read the writing unto the king to make known to him the interpretation. So this is interesting because here's something to think about. Those who function under the influence of the Spirit of God have increased capabilities, not because of their own qualifications, but because of the power of God which they are privileged to use. They are servants in the Lord's hands who are to bless others and carry out the Lord's will. Daniel knew this and neither deserved nor sought for earthly rewards for his role as an instrument in the hands of God. That's from the Old Testament study manual. So Daniel's going, it's not, I don't need the rewards. I'm not here for that. I'm here to tell you the truth. I'm here to reveal God's word to you. And so he's not doing it for personal gain. He wants to maintain his integrity and his humility as he is doing this. Verse 18, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. So there's kind of this contraries idea that Nebuchadnezzar had choice over people's lives. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. That could have been that time when he went crazy that we learned in the last chapter. Verse 21, he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts. His dwelling was in the wild with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was set with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So maybe that's when Nebuchadnezzar lost power, and it went to somebody else who usurped that power, and then it switched over again, and we had a few changes over basically before we got to Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Verse 22, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. So he's like, you should have known. You did everything bad Nebuchadnezzar did, and you saw what happened to him. You should have known better. You had an example, and you didn't follow it. So verse 23, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold and brass and wood and iron and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, that the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. So again, he's reiterating, you should have known better, but you're denying the God that helped Nebuchadnezzar out, and Nebuchadnezzar denied him eventually as well, and he went crazy, and he got these challenges, and you're not doing any better, Belshazzar, basically. So verse 24, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. It said, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. So let's look at these words here for a second, okay? Mene means numbered. God has numbered the days of the kingdom, basically. So God has numbered the days of your kingdom. That's repeated twice. Tekel is a shekel, basically, used both as coin and as a weight, indicated that Belshazzar was weighed in the balances and found deficient. So Mene is numbered. Your kingdom is numbered. Your time is up. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Now, what's interesting is they mention in later, as he goes through this, so verse 26, the interpretation of the king, Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Now, here's what's interesting is instead of Upharsin in verse 25, in verse 28 it says Perez. So the word, there's two different words here. So let's look at this. Perez, division. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The word Perez would seem to point out that the Persians were the dominant power to whom Babylon would fall. When Daniel read the writing, he read and parsin. But in giving the interpretation, he employed the form Perez. We have thus a play upon words in which the basic idea of division is linked with the name of the conqueror. So Upharsin means divided, but in verse 28 he says Perez. He changes the word, meaning you're still divided, and it's the Persians who are going to get it. So the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So these are Aramaic words, basically, that he's reading, which is a common language spoken in Babylon. Now that might sound familiar, like, why have I heard that term Aramaic? Aramaic is the language that the Jews speak at the time of Jesus during the New Testament. This is where they got Aramaic from, was the Babylonian exile. So they switched from using Hebrew to Aramaic after the Babylonian exile. This is where it comes from. Aramaic is a Semitic language, and it is predominantly coming from Babylonian, Chalcedon, these areas. And it comes out of there, and then the Jews adopt it after the exile or during the exile. And then they come back. The Jews that didn't leave had Hebrew. The Jews that did leave had Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic later overtook it and became the dominant language, which is why Christ and his apostles spoke it during the New Testament times. So that's where this is all coming from, basically. Verse 29, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, here's something we got to look at this. Okay, again, they're making his third ruler. Okay, they wrote the wrong word, yet it means the same thing. All this means the tree is about to be cut down and the golden head is giving way to the neck of silver. So think of the parables we've had. Even though they're making Daniel one of three, the kingdom is gone. And you can tell Daniel's not excited. He's getting this. They're like, oh, thank you for interpreting this. Here, you can have all this stuff. But he's like, this doesn't mean anything. Your kingdom is gone. I'm not going to be a ruler over nothing. This is stupid. So, but it's interesting. Remember, the head is gone. The neck is coming in. The tree has been cut down and capped off. That's all these metaphors are coming together in the reality of what's happening here. So these next two verses are very important for us to look at. In that night, okay, was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now here's what's interesting. If we look at this, okay, verse 29, they still give Daniel the interpretation, but Daniel's interpretation is your kingdom is gone. Shouldn't Belshazzar have been mad at Daniel, going, why are you prophesying my kingdom is gone? We are the great Babylonian kingdom. So the Old Testament study manual had a comment on this. It says, although Belshazzar did not believe that Daniel's God was the only true God, it is likely that he, like other heathens, believed in the gods and in revelations from God. He must have been deeply impressed with Daniel's ability to interpret the writing on the wall because he rewarded him. So he still gave Daniel the reward that he was to give him. In fact, Delitzsch, Kyle and Delitzsch in their Bible commentary suggested another possible reason. Belshazzar perhaps scarcely believed the threatened judgment from God to be so near as it actually was. And perhaps he hoped to be able, by conferring honor upon Daniel, to appease the wrath of God. So maybe giving Daniel the stuff was trying to appease God, and then he's trying to figure out, okay, he didn't give me a time frame when it was going to happen, so maybe I got some time to figure this out. Nope, he didn't have any time. He was dead by the next day. So let's look at this idea. Okay, verse 30 is interesting. The king of Belshazzar, the king was slain, and then Darius took over, basically Babylon. Babylon fell overnight. So the ancient Greek historian Herodotus recorded that Cyrus had previously caused the Palakopus a canal. So let's look at this. Okay, and this is from Herodotus, and Herodotus is a Greek historian. Not everything he said was completely true. Scholars used to think he was like the expert in history because he's an ancient historian. But now we're finding out, maybe some of his stories weren't quite as accurate as we thought. I'm not sure if this one's one of those or not. But look at this. Look at this idea. Okay, Babylon. Okay, if you go back and think of like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, when we talk about Babylon there, Babylon had a wall that was really tall, and it had several levels of wall inside of it, basically. So it had a couple of walls. It was really thick with these, like a couple of dual walls together, basically, with a gap in between them. So huge, it's just this big, massive wall. All this defensive forces around it. Nobody's getting into this. Herodotus believes there's a few stories, and we talk about some of these analogies and ideas in Jeremiah. So you can go back and read those in there. But Herodotus says that Cyrus had previously caused the Palakopus, a canal which ran west of the city and carried off the superfluous water of the Euphrates into the lake of Nitocris, to be cleared out. in order to turn the river into it, which by this means was rendered so shallow that his soldiers were able to penetrate along its bed into the city. So that's Samuel Fallow's Popular Critical Bible and Encyclopedia and Scriptural Dictionary under Babylon. So they think what might have happened was, again, to have a big city, you have to have a water source. Water comes in, which is fresh water for drinking and watering and everything else. And then water goes out, which is the wastewater that takes it back out. So they diverted a part of the Euphrates River to go through Babylon, basically, and use it as their water source. So he just broke the dam to allow the water to divert off the canal and go the right way. And then they used the canal to crawl under the wall into Babylon to take it over. So they're coming up through the springs and the wells and things, got into the city, took the city without having much of a major fight because the armies were inside the city. So that is a possibility of what happened to the destruction of Babylon. And I like that story because I think it's a great metaphor for our day and age. You know, if you want to think about this idea of how do you protect your children from the outside forces of the world. Okay, we think about locking our windows and doors. We think about putting blinds up so people can't see inside your home. But Wi-Fi can come right through your house. Your children can be bullied over the internet while they're in your home. You can physically keep them safe, but because of the internet, it's hard to keep them completely safe. You could have, while your kids are playing video games online, you could have predators talking to them. They're not physically present, but they are virtually present. So I think this is a great metaphor to think about what are the other things that maybe not be so obvious to us to help protect those we want to protect. So a fun little metaphor that's there. There are some other stories I'll bring up and talk about. There is a story out there of a governor. So the king wasn't like sole ruler of everything. He had lower rulers, like a governor over certain regions, and the governors reported up to other people who reported up to the king. So there's a hierarchical structure of organization in the kingdom. There's a story possibly that there was a governor who was pretty disgruntled at how the kingdom was being ran. He didn't like what was going on. And so he formed a secret alliance with the Persians. And basically he happened to be at Babylon at the same time. And he opened the back door and let the Persians in. Maybe that's a possibility too. Some people say that there's a possibility of a spy. A Persian literally had plastic surgery, altered their face so that they looked more Babylonian, and then gained access into the city, and then went and opened the doors at the right time. At that okay, you go in, and at this day, this time, hopefully the doors will be there for you. That's another possibility of what happened as well. We're not sure 100%, but anyways, the fall of Babylon went really, really fast. So realize that that's a type and shadow of how the destruction of the wicked is going to be in the last days. That's our future. It's going to be fast, and you're not going to see it coming, basically. In fact, Henry Thomas Frank discussed the reasons why the city even then surrendered so easily. Now, Cyrus is actually the king that did this. It wasn't Darius. Darius was a later king of Persia. So again, we're having a challenge here on the history because it says Darius is the one that took the kingdom, but it was actually Cyrus that did. Cyrus' orders preceded him to the city. No revenge was to be taken. The city was to have its normal life restored as quickly as possible. The gods which Nabonidus had taken from the equally well-treated provincial cities were to be restored at once. There was, above all, to be no terrorizing of the population. Indeed, Cyrus intended to change some of the policies of Nabonidus which had made him objectionable to his subjects. One can imagine the reception Cyrus received when he made his appearance in the capital a few weeks after its capture. He was not a conqueror, he was a liberator. And far from installing a foreign rule over the people, Cyrus personally took the role of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, in the New Year festival, thereby claiming for himself and his heirs the right to rule the Babylonian Empire by divine designation. This is from the book Discovering the Bible World. Now, think about this, okay? So maybe the party that Belshazzar was having was the year festival. Okay, this is like the annual year rites type festival to pronounce who's the king and things. Suddenly, Darius comes in, takes over, or Cyrus comes in, takes over the place, and then it puts himself up there following the same rites and makes himself king. Basically says, I have the right to rule. Now, it's interesting that we see Cyrus more as a liberator, not as a conqueror. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, when he went into Babylon, was a conqueror. Cyrus was helping the people. So the people were obviously disgruntled at Nabonidus and Belshazzar and how rule was happening. Remember, we heard the story in the last chapter about Nabonidus. He changed the religion of Babylon to go away from Marduk to Sin. So the sun god versus the high god. So it really, it's semantics, from our standpoint. They're both false idols. But for them, it was a big deal to have this change. Marduk was the god of everything for them, basically. And so Cyrus comes in going, I'm going to restore Marduk. We're going to put this back up. It's sort of like, oh, yes, Cyrus isn't taking us over. Cyrus is restoring us to where we should be. So it's an interesting, different perspective we see. People weren't revolting and reviling against Cyrus. They were happy he was there because they hated the current king, basically. Now, it does mention Medians and Persians in here as well. So let's talk about them for just a little bit here. The Medes were a group that the Persians took over or joined to as they marched towards Babylon. So the Persians and the Medes were two different groups, but they later joined together in alliances to fight and take over areas, basically. Let's see. The conventional view states that Cyrus the Persian conquered Media in 553 BC and deposed the last Median king. Cyrus, as king of Persia, reigned over the entire Medo-Persian Empire when Babylon fell in 539 BC. However, most scholars were unaware that the Greek historian Xenophon describes a Median king whom he calls Cyaxares II, who corresponds very closely to Daniel's Darius the Mede. The view that Cyaxares II is Darius the Mede was the standard Jewish and Christian interpretation from Josephus and Jerome until Kyle in the 1870s, but it was abandoned after cuneiform inscriptions were discovered that seemed to support Herodotus' account of the accession of Cyrus, which does not allow for the existence of Xenophon's Cyaxares II. Some scholars believe that Cyrus and Cyaxares co-ruled the joint empires until the fall of the Babylonian Empire, where Cyrus then eventually takes over as main ruler. This matter is not resolved yet in the scholarly world, however. If you follow Herodotus' history, he follows what Cyrus published about himself, but if you follow the Greek historian Xenophon, who follows the history of Daniel very closely, he talks of this other person. So there's some discrepancies in the history itself, basically. Not just necessarily with Daniel, but with the history itself. Some issues that have to be worked out. So scholars don't know everything, and they're doing the best they can with the data they've been given, basically. So this is, in fact, let me read this. This comes out of Major Teachings of the 12 Prophets by Blair, Van Dyke, and Kelly Ogden. They had this to say that kind of goes along these same lines. Babylon's greatest rival was the Medes to the northeast. While the two had been allies against Assyria, Media now waited for an opportunity to increase their borders at Babylon's expense. An uprising within Media, led by a vassal king named Cyrus of Persia, east of Babylon, was likely a welcomed disruption. A brilliant military leader, Cyrus went on to overtake the entire Median Empire by 550 BC. Given the size and military might of the new Persian Empire, Babylon posed little threat. After enlarging Persian interests to the east, the forces of Cyrus eventually turned their attention to Babylon, taking her without a fight in 539 BC. The policies of Cyrus toward peoples he conquered were markedly different from those of the Babylonians and the Assyrians. He instituted a policy of respect for the religious and cultural beliefs and practices of those living within his realm. So Cyrus signals a very different perspective. Assyrians would march in, clear out your culture, and adopt their culture into it. Babylonians would let you have your culture, but you kind of still had to follow their culture too, and they still would destroy you and take people out and cause all kinds of damage and destruction. And Cyrus is like, nah, let's actually be nice to the people. Let's take a whole nother approach to things. So this is like world-changing concept. Instead of destroying the people, we're going to be nice to them. Cyrus issued a royal decree ordering the restoration of the exiled Jews to Jerusalem. So Cyrus saw in himself, and we're going to see this as we go into Daniel more, Cyrus believed, because the Jews are like, we had a prophecy of a great person who would come and liberate us. And so he saw himself as the liberator of the Jews. While, reappointing Marduk and everything else, he was restoring the truth. He was a tool in God's hand. So he kind of enjoyed this benevolence that he was given, basically. He also commissioned the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem to facilitate the worship of Jehovah. Finally, Cyrus appointed Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, presumably the same man of the kingly line that is called Shenazar in 1 Chronicles 3:18, the son of King Jehoiachin. So Jehoiachin's dead, but his son rules, and he is appointed to be the governor of the area, to lead the first group of exiles back to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding the temple. It is likely that only the hardiest Jews and those most committed to rebuilding the temple traveled back to Jerusalem with Sheshbazzar in this initial group. Apparently, many Jews were by then very comfortable in Babylon and offered their resources to assist others, but were not interested in returning themselves. Josephus reported that the rulers of the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, with the Levites and priests, went in haste to Jerusalem, yet did many of them stay at Babylon and not willing to leave their possessions. Now, let's just pause for a second here on this quote. Okay, so this is the beginning of the beginning of the end of the Babylonian exile for the Jews. This exile we've been reading about since the time of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah and Ezekiel and now Daniel. Okay, it was prophesied back with Isaiah, and we are now at the point in history around 539 BC. The exile is coming to an end. The Jews are going to be let go and go back to Jerusalem. Now, here's the problem. 70 years have gone by. So the people who were in the exile, who lived at Jerusalem, who Babylon brought, it's their children or their grandchildren that are alive now. They've all died off. There's a whole nother generation. And these people haven't known what was really there. Unless they were a really young child at the beginning, like Daniel possibly, he's still alive apparently at this destruction of Babylon. So there might be a few that were left, but they were really young. So most of the people, though, are going to be people most of the Jews that are returning are most likely not the ones that left. They are the next generation. And a lot of them have built homes. They've built families. They've had children, and their children have children. They've moved on with life in Babylon, and they're like, why do we go back? Because what's left in Jerusalem? That's what we're going to talk about in this next quote here. Upon their arrival in Jerusalem, they found the mere shell of a city. Nevertheless, the small band began at once to rebuild the temple. Progress was slow, however, as a series of setbacks such as crop failures, drought, and the onset of extreme poverty hindered their efforts. We're going to see this in the lesser prophets after we get through Daniel. It was during these early days that Sheshabar's nephew, Zerubbabel, arrived in Jerusalem at the head of another group of returning exiles. He became the governor of Judah, presumably at the death of his uncle, and was the final Davidic descendant to govern in Judah. With him came lingering hopes of an eventual return to the ancient monarchy. As we shall see, these hopes would be extinguished at the death of Zerubbabel, Amos through Malachi. So again, we get into the lesser prophets. We're going to see the rest of this play out as the Jews went back. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a good time. It was a big struggle. And so a lot of challenges faced them to go back and do this. So we're going to see this play out through those. So stay tuned for those chapters as we get in there. But let's first, of course, continue with the book of Daniel. And then we'll move on to the rest of as the exile returns, the beginning of the second temple period is about to commence as well.